George Galloway is rarely out of the news for very long. A year ago, he notched up a majority of 10,000 to become the Respect Party MP for Bradford West. He attracted scathing headlines when he visited Saddam Hussein and praised him for his indefatigability. And similar scornful reports followed when he imitated a cat and lapped milk from the cupped hands of Rula Lenska in Big Brother. I met George Galloway in his Westminster office. He was outspoken and his opinions were as controversial as ever. I asked him first how he reacted to criticism that he spent too much time on affairs abroad at the expense of his constituents at home.
Parliament has to deal with every kind of matter. This week, for example, I made 2 speeches in the House, one on the budget and one on the pre-Easter adjournment debate. In both of those speeches, I dealt with both domestic, Bradford, British and international issues. And of course, the Parliament has to have that vista. We're not what we were. We don't rule the world from this building as once we did, but we clearly are affected by what happens in the world, even in the most explosive and bloody way. We were affected here in London, in my then constituency in East London, when 4 individuals blew themselves up on the London Underground and on a London bus. Now, it's my case, I think it's widely shared now, that that kind of thing is related to Britain's role in the world and the kind of things that we do in the world. So somebody in here needs to have the bigger picture. And as it's my case, that Britain's role with the United States in the war on Iraq and in the injustice suffered by the Palestinian people, for example, these things are storing up trouble for us internationally, but also here at home.
You don't always take the establishment side. In fact, you very rarely seem to take the establishment side in any sort of tug of war. You have had your critics in this one on the Palestine-Israeli cause not so long ago, a few weeks ago, when you walked out of the debate at Oxford. And I suppose somebody might say, well, it wasn't very democratic, was it?
Well, it's a question of boycott. I wouldn't have debated apartheid with a supporter of apartheid from racist South Africa. And I'm not going to do it in a debate about apartheid in Palestine. So it's a principal question. It's not a tactical one.
Does this not fly in the face of democracy, though, George? Because surely, as Churchill said, jaw is always better than war.
Sure, I'm in favour of jaw between Israel and the Palestinians, but I'm not a Palestinian, and I don't represent them. They ought to have been talking, jaw-jawing, with the Palestinian leadership all along, and perhaps if they had, we wouldn't be in this mess. I'm not against Israelis per se. I'm certainly not against Jews in any circumstances. But an Israeli citizen who supports the Israeli apartheid state, they'll have to talk to the Palestinians, not me.
The Labour MP George Galloway has been severely reprimanded by his party for a visit to Iraq in which he praised Saddam Hussein on Iraqi television. Mr Galloway said his remarks had been taken out of context, but he apologised for any offence he had caused.
Your take on the conflict in Iran drew criticism from both left and right, so I suppose you could claim to have got it right in the middle on that occasion.
I think so. The funny thing is, last night I addressed a very establishment club called the Devonshire House Club, which meets and has met for 37 years. And my views on the Iraq war chimed with, I think, everyone except one person in the whole. None of them were revolutionaries, none of them were Arabists, but they were people who have seen how the Iraq war has turned out. And I think you'd find very, very great difficulty in finding an audience anywhere now in the United Kingdom or anywhere in the world that any longer believes that the Bush and Blair war against Iraq turned out to be the right thing to do.
Tell me about Saddam, because he's this mythical figure almost, and just as it seemed we were getting to know what he was all about, suddenly he was dead. How did you find him?
Well, he was a very big figure, and I think your listeners need to know something important, a very popular one in the Arab and Muslim world, who made very big mistakes and committed some very big crimes. And also, I say not but and also, had some considerable achievements.
How did he come across to you as a man, though? Because you talked to him for an hour and a half, and you couldn't have talked policy and strategy all that time.
Well, it would be easier for me to say to you, and safer for me to say to you, he came across as a monster or something like that, but he didn't, and that would be untrue, and I don't tell untruths. He was steady. He was absolutely sane. He was determined to avoid the war if he could. He told me the truth. He told me, look, we would not lie to you. After all you've done to help the Iraqi people, we would not lie to you. We do not have weapons of mass destruction. At the time, as I said in my book, I thought, my God, he's even lying to me. Turned out the dictator was telling the truth, and the so-called leaders of the free world were telling the lies.
But the reports of his tyranny, do you believe those, or do you think this was propaganda?
No, there's a very significant element of propaganda, but no doubt Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator in terms of the crushing of dissent, political, but mainly religious, actually. It's quite ironic. Most of Saddam's tyranny was bent upon crushing Islamist fundamentalism, the very thing that Britain and America is currently trying to do.
I'm trying to imagine you, George, heading out to Baghdad. You, a seasoned politician, you know about spin, you know about manipulation. There must have been a small niggling doubt in the back of your brain saying, I'm being used here for political sort of chicanery almost, to be used here as propaganda.
No, because I think I was right. And it turned out that the Iraqis were right. They didn't have weapons of mass destruction.
There's a possibility, though, that a British politician going out there could be used for propaganda purposes. For instance, if you go out now, as you do, to appear in Middle Eastern television programmes, are you not slightly fearful that you're there for some other reason?
Actually, the British politicians who were used for propaganda purposes were those who were supporting the British and American government line, which turned out to be a lie. It was they who were being used for propaganda purposes, and it was they who were wrong. If they knew they were wrong, they were liars. If they didn't know they were wrong, they were fools. I'm the person who's been proved right by events.
Well, George Galloway MP is here. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Are you going to be any more conscientious representing the people of Bradford than you were in Bethnal Green?
Oh, don't start by insulting me now. Let's not go
well,
off
it's true. Come on.
Let's not get off on
there's a more serious point here
bad
because
start.
Let's go back to Dundee, to this young lad, George Galloway, who's a pretty good footballer by all accounts, I believe.
Not bad, yeah. I did have some hopes of making it in football. I was rather short, actually, for a centre forward.
That was George Best.
He was, but then he was very much more gifted than I. I had quite a good knack of putting the ball in the net. But unless you're Jimmy Greaves or Gert Muller, for older listeners, a short centre forward rarely makes it. And I remember once I played against Derek Johnson, who went on to great things at Rangers and Scotland, and he seemed like a foot taller than I. And I scored no goals that day, and he scored 11. And that taught me that that foot's quite important in top-flight football.
George Galloway, the Labour Party candidate, 17,958.
You joined the Labour Party when you were 13, is this right?
I did, yes. I always looked older than my age, something I was happy about when I was young and not so happy about now. I looked 15, so I passed for 15, and I joined the Labour Party. It's not as weird as it sounds because my parents were both Labour members and my father a trade union activist in the engineering union. So I was brought up in a political household.
Your mother's from Ireland, wasn't she?
Yes. My mother's side of the family are from County Longford in the Irish Republic, and like many people in Scotland, my maternal grandfather emigrated to Scotland, ended up in Glasgow on the cattle boat with no shoes, in Anderston Quay, which I came to represent in Parliament, actually. And I'm glad that my grandparents lived to see the day that the place where they arrived with no shoes in a cattle boat, I was now the Member of Parliament for that quay. And they walked the road and the miles to Dundee and set up in a place called Lochee, known as Tipperary, which is the Irish immigrant quarter of the city, and they worked in the jute and flax mills, like many, many thousands of others. My father, on the other hand, is from yeoman Scottish stock. He was a very Scottish man.
Your mother, being Irish, would have nurtured in Republican ideals, presumably.
Yes, in fact, we lived for a time in the same street as James Connolly, and my grandfather used to talk about James Connolly every New Year, usually after a few Guinnesses. James Connolly was, of course, described by the great Scottish poet Hugh MacDiarmid as Scotch steel tempered with Irish fire, which I always thought of as a very, very high compliment. And yes, that Republican anti-imperialist trend is very much part of my makeup. I distinctly recall, in fact, I've now got them into the Penguin Book of Quotations. I came home and told my Irish grandfather that the teacher had said, pointing at a map, that Britain had an empire so vast that upon it the sun never set. And he answered, that's because God would never trust the British in the dark.
Well, given your nationalistic tendencies in Ireland and Palestine, etc., it is rather surprising that you don't really wholeheartedly back Scottish independence.
No, I wholeheartedly oppose Scottish independence, and my support for Irish unity has nothing to do with nationalism. You're talking to one of the few men who actually has no national feeling of any kind. I once told my daughter, now a mother of 3, but when she was a child, when she asked me, what are we, Daddy? Are we Scottish, British, Irish? What are we? I said, my country is the future, and my flag is red. And I meant it then, I mean it now. I support Irish unity because it's a question of imperialism and a denial of democracy. The Irish people voted in overwhelming number almost 100 years ago for a united, independent country, and that must be respected. The same as if the Scots vote in 2014, September I think it's now going to be, for independence, they must have it.
But why are you against it at this point? Is it economic grounds or historic grounds?
There are many reasons. To break up a small country, small English-speaking country, in one island, when there is no pressing need to do so, is just a foolish thing to do. It will not lead to a socialist Scotland, as some deluded people imagine that it would. Indeed, quite the opposite. Scotland will then get involved in a race to the bottom with England for low levels of corporate taxation, even low levels of personal taxation, because the idea that you can have high levels of public taxation in Edinburgh and low levels in Newcastle, and that big earners are going to stay in Edinburgh rather than go to Newcastle or Manchester or whatever is fanciful. And certainly companies will not do so. So in fact, there will be no social progress in an independent Scotland, and some of the social progress that has been achieved under devolution will have to be relinquished because the country will not be able to afford free prescription charges, free university education and so on, as the SNP are now conceding. The question of the currency, which currency will it be? It certainly, I can assure them, will not be the British pound, because the Bank of England will not allow a government over which it has no influence to use the same currency as people who are under its influence. The fiscal possibilities of that and monetary possibilities of that are obvious. Is it going to be the euro? Well, good luck with that. How's the euro going? All these, there are so many financial and economic arguments against Scottish independence that I'll be very surprised if it passes. But my last point is this: it will doom England to perpetual Tory rule. And that's not a good thing for England. It's definitely not a good thing for Scotland either.
We haven't met before, so any perception I have of you has to be on what I've read about
Sure.
you. And I've read so many times, A, that you're a misogynist, and I've also read that you love women, which you clearly do.
The latter is true.
You like the company of women.
Indeed.
But you can't love women and be a misogynist, can you?
I've had many accusations thrown at me, but that must be one of the most bizarre. No. Actually, I far prefer the company of women to the company of men. As you know, my good wife is with me in the office now and is always with me. I don't drink, never have. I don't like the kind of bawdy boys' night out You would never find me at a stag night or any of that stuff. No, I prefer a quiet life, preferably with a woman that I love. So, no, a misogynist, I certainly am not.
08459 555 678.
It's been quoted in various papers the time of the WikiLeaks trial.
Yeah, Assange, yeah.
I can't remember the exact quote. It was something like it was to do with etiquette rather than rape.
Yes,
was that a misquote, or did you actually say that?
It's a distortion. It was my statement of the incontestable fact that most couples do not verbally ask each other if they can have sex. When people are a couple and they're in bed, they kind of do it or they don't do it. It's something more amorphous than a verbalized proposition.
Your relationship with the press is, well, it's not love-hate, it's more hate-hate almost.
Yes.
But editors must love you, George, because you are very good copy, aren't you? You can be relied upon to have a quote, to have an opinion, and be forthright in saying it. Do you ever wish sometimes that you weren't quite as valuable in the things that you say?
Well, if editors love me, they have a funny way of showing it. The lifelong battle that I have had against the press was not of my choosing, but of theirs. In a way, it's a backhanded compliment. I mean, there are other people in politics, even in this building, who hold almost entirely identical views to mine, but they don't attract very much press attention, and that's because perhaps they're not quite as effective at expressing it as I am. They haven't built something as I think I have. On the Palestinian question, when I started it, you could have fitted all the supporters of the PLO into this room and had room for an elephant at the back. Now we are millions, and I've played a part in that. The movement against the war in Iraq became a movement of millions in Britain, and I was one of the leaders of that, and so on. So I was ahead of my time on some things, and perhaps the fate of someone who's ahead of their time is to take that kind of lash. I'm very, very lucky that it doesn't bother me much.
It bothers you now and again, mind you. Well, you have bit back on a couple of occasions, haven't you?
I was just about to make a qualification to that. They can call me bad, they can even call me mad, they can call me sad, but they mustn't lie about what I've said and lie about what I've done. There's enough in what I say and do to criticize. If you have a different point of view, you can attack me vehemently for it. That doesn't bother me at all. But if somebody said I was there when in fact I was here, or here when I was there, and that I did this when I didn't, or said that when I didn't, that's intolerable, because mendacity of that kind makes normal political discourse and proper debate impossible.
George Galloway's supporters were outside the High Court to greet him. The MP had come to hear the outcome of his libel case against the Daily Telegraph.
When you took on the Daily Telegraph, I think it was, and the News of the World over the phone hacking, you must have realised you were going into a den of lions, because taking on the Fourth Estate, taking on the might of the press is fraught with danger, is it not?
Well, the Daily Telegraph case cost £2.3 million in damages and costs. And if I had lost it, the £2.3 million bill would have been paid by me. I couldn't have paid it, so I'd have lost my house, my seat in Parliament, my life. So it was a very, very big pack of lions to take on. But my father, God rest his soul, actually used to use the lion's den metaphor to me. Dare to be a Daniel, dare to stand alone. That's what he said to me more than once. So I had no qualms about doing that on a personal level, any more than I had of being a Daniel in the lion's den at the US Senate in 2005. But more importantly than that, I had no choice but to challenge what was a gigantic lie, an Everest of a lie, which would have made, if it had been true, my life a lie. That I had done all this for Iraq, for the people, to stop the war, to end the sanctions, that I had done all this because somebody was paying me secretly to do it. As it happens, Saddam Hussein never gave me one brass farthing, but the newspapers that claimed that he had to give me a very great deal of money.
He offered you 10 Equality Street, did he not?
Yes, I did have a
Did you declare
street.
that?
The chocolate of choice of the dictator of Iraq was Equality Street, and I once brought a bottle of HP sauce to the Foreign Minister, Tariq Aziz, because under sanctions he hadn't been able to get any, and he didn't really like his dinner without HP sauce in it. So they never gave me anything, but those who falsely claimed that they have had to give me plenty. And they say there's no God.
Is there a God in your reckoning?
For sure there's a God.
You're a religious man, are you?
I am a religious believer, and I have been all my life. I think my press officer is getting twitchy at this point because he's one of these who thinks we oughtn't to do God, but life doesn't make sense without the idea of God. No, I mean it ironically, that this great assault on me in the United States and in Britain actually made me much, much bigger politically than if it had never happened. Now I have a weekly radio show in the United States, thanks to the US Senate attempt to hang me. I go on speaking tours of the United States. I have a big audience in Britain, thanks in part to all these attacks. So, going back to your original question, I am one of these who believes that not until the last editor is strangled by the last copy of the Daily Telegraph will we be truly free.
I'm Not the Only One, the name of your autobiography. I take it that's from the John Lennon song,
Yes.
is it? From
Yes.
Imagine? Yeah.
Yes, it is, yes. Matter of fact, Sean Lennon just contacted me, John's son from America, to say that he's a big fan of mine and has watched all my YouTube videos, which, considering there's more than 30,000 of them, it's quite a claim. But I was perhaps unnaturally chuffed to get that contact from John Lennon's own blood. Yeah, it is from that song, and I do like to imagine that someday we'll be as one.
But the back end of the pantomime horse has to be government. We don't elect Findus, we don't elect food companies, we elect government to protect us.
We're seated here in Westminster, the seat of power, the seat of the government, and surrounded by the ghosts of parliamentarians and statesmen and orators down through the years. Now, your own oratorial skills have got you out of a lot of messes. Probably got you into a few as well, come to think of it over the years.
That's probably a very good way of putting it. If I hadn't kissed the Blarney Stone quite so often, which I actually did physically kiss it, maybe I wouldn't be in so much demand, but I wouldn't have got into so much trouble, that's true. But this is, of course, you're right, the ghosts of great orators of the past are all around us. On the way to see you, I passed an Aaron Bevan, the great left-wing Welshman. But my favourite parliamentarian, my parliamentary idol, is someone that your listeners will not be so familiar with. Charles James Fox was the greatest of all parliamentarians in this building. He was the only British parliamentarian to support the French Revolution. Indeed, he tabled, here I'm about to fall out with some of your listenership, he tabled a motion congratulating the people of France on the beheading of their king and queen and looking forward to the day when the same fate befell all the crowned heads of Europe. He was the only British parliamentarian to support the Americans in the War of Independence. You can imagine the hatred that engendered against him. He was thrice thrown out of Parliament and thrice returned, literally on the shoulders of the people of this constituency, and he was a very, very great orator. His speeches, even today, more than 2 centuries later, are pure poetry. He was a magnificent figure. The only difference between him and me is that he was a better orator than me, that he copiously drank alcohol and drank his father's inheritance, the equivalent of about £12 million. He drank and gambled. I neither drink nor gamble. Indeed, here I'll please some of your listeners. Ian Paisley, the Reverend Ian Paisley Sr. And I were frequently in the same lobby. That's a surprise to you, because we were the only two who opposed clause by clause the introduction of the national lottery in this country. The exact words that the Reverend Paisley used to me: fancy me in a a wee pape like you, being the only people in this entire building standing up for the true faith.
I can hear him saying it.
By the way, I had very warm relations with Ian Paisley, as I do with his son, which is a peculiar fact of life in Parliament, that one can make relations with the most unlikely of people, and they with you.
A lovely harmony, a good harmonic note to end. George Galloway, it's been my pleasure. Thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thanks.
John Bennett was in conversation with George Galloway.